after the keynotes, if you like, it moves into much more of a forum format. So there's a lot more kind of chance for interaction, a lot more give and take, a series of quite extraordinary your list things in threes and only ever think of two. It's a character flaw. Just a note that if you wanted to have a gun and reframing self-care in the great see, disruptors don't put their hands up. I just felt that is a rookie mistake right now. You people are hopeless. We have an amazing lineup here to talk about in this post-truth climate, the vital role that artists play as agents of social change. It's hosted by the incomparable jazz singer and community activist Mama Alto. I'm going to throw over to Mama now.
Thank you, Michael. So, we're here today to discuss artist as disruptor. And actually, I think the very presence of the three formidable genius artists joining me on the panel today at this conference was in itself a little bit of an act of artistic disruption. I saw that the initial release of the schedule of the panel mostly featured arts administrators, policymakers, very few artists. So I said, you know, who are some of the most fantastic, visionary, incendiary ladies that I know? And we're going to go in there and deliver a keynote transformative that honours the intelligence of audiences, that treasures humanity, that opens up discourses around freedom, hope, and agency, and emasculates an unequal status quo. Moira Finucane. You can applaud me. We have the inimitable Candy Bowers. Candy Bowers is an award-winning writer, actor, social activist, comedian, producer, and Black intersectional feminist. The co-artistic director of Black Honey Company, Candy has pioneered a fierce subgenre of hip-hop theatre that delves into the heart of radical feminist dreaming. Candy Bowers. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Genevieve Greaves, who is an Indigenous educator, curator, filmmaker, artist, oral historian, researcher and writer who has accumulated nearly 20 years' experience in the arts and culture industries. She is Worimi, traditionally from mid-North Coast New South Wales, but has lived and worked on Kulin country for many years and is also a staff member here at Melbourne Museum. Genevieve Greaves. So to kick us off, I actually want to start by inviting our panellists to give an act of artistic disruption, an act of interrogation of the very concept and idea of post-truth, which is something I know that Nate DeMeo in a keynote earlier today also referenced. But let's talk about this, maybe a false idea, maybe a true idea. What do we think of these ideas of post-truth?
Good, thank you. I project all night long at the moment, so I'm happy for a microphone. It's an interesting concept, and often my interrogation is around why something bubbles up, and I'm looking for it's coming up because there's some kind of interaction going on, or is it bubbling up in order to once again barricade us back into the status quo, to the colonized white patriarchal spot. And what I'm finding a lot is that it's about barricading us back in rather than having more freedom of thought and thinking. And it's quite extraordinary, I think, the way it's happening in Australia. The Australian newspaper, what an incredible space that is right now. Clearly political, I don't know, like throughout my entire career as a student and as an artist, I've done things like this young dancer is doing at the VCA by segregating audiences and bringing race to the fore. So for somebody to say that shouldn't be allowed, or that's racist towards white, the things that I start seeing intermingling in this notion, and you know, it's all about perspective. It's such a slippery topic, but I like to try and find ways of making it tangible, things that we can hook into, because that slipperiness is also a tool, a tool to keep us unable to articulate, you know, in the same position. So I like to seek the things that see us moving, see us breaking through, see us kind of shifting on to the next, because cultural shifting is happening. Australia seems to be one of the countries that I kind of move around and through a bit that seems to be the most afraid of those shifts. I'm currently working at the Art Centre in a show for the Melbourne Theatre Company. I know a few people in the house are involved or engaged in it. So I'm very aware, you know, I'm almost at the moment, I've come from the field into the house, and I'm, you know, feeling what that is. And what's really funny is there's lots of folks inside that are interested in beginning to shift, but there are a lot of structures that are holding that back. So the very notion of what post-truth means, that links into this conversation of like, but is it racist? But is it actually racist? But is it misogyny? Is it? You know, you can go on that cycle rather than actually going, this is what this is. This is how it has affected all of these people. This is why this person, even if it's not their fault that they're in that position, is in that position and the only voice on this. And if we want to change anything, we've got to actually come right up against the things that make the comfort of it all, and confront and shake that tree, yeah?
So perhaps maybe in that, an idea that the concept of post-truth might merely reinforce ideas that there is not a plurality of truths or a multiplicity of perspectives.
I guess as I was thinking about this yesterday and today, I do not think we live in a post-truth era. I looked it up in the dictionary. Post means subsequent to, following on from. So if we live in a post-truth era, prior to this there was a truth era. And that is not true. And I know that. So I think we live in a pre-truth era.
That's dope.
I think that, and I think it is dangerous to imagine that we had hold of the truth and that the Trump era, which often people think about, and globally, if we just zoom in on the Me Too movement for a moment, we are being hit in the chops by a truth. It is a global tsunami coming at us, and it is a truth era opening up from a pre-truth era where women of all kinds, of all races, in all countries, of all religious beliefs, cradle to grave, experience structural, acute and chronic oppression. Physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, it's a banquet. And so Me Too is a truth moment, there's a truth era. And in Australia there's some really exciting things happening. The Family Violence Reconciliation, the Family Violence Royal Commission and the Royal Commission on Sexual Abuse in Institutions is another massive boulder moving away from seeing the truth. So I think we are in a pre-truth era, and I think one of the dangers, another danger of a post-truth idea, is that we can't see that some of the truths that are coming out now are unbelievably important and unbelievably, you know what Candy was saying, which is this is a moment that we can grab. For the first time in a curriculum in Australia, we have respectful relationships, which is now coming out of the Family Violence Royal Commission curriculum across every single school in the state. So we are in a pre-truth era. And you know, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, that is a statement saying, let's move towards truth. From this pre-truth era, let us gallop. Let us gallop.
And and that was partly what I was interested in about in interrogating the idea of post-truth, which both Moira and Candy have spoken to, is the way in which the false idea of a post-truth era reinforces the idea that there was ever a singular truth. And when we look at that idea of a singular truth, that might actually be a construction, a false construction of what is presumed to be objective knowledge. That is actually an arbitrary construction along the interests of certain power dynamics. So for Eurocentric, white, patriarchal, cisgendered, able-bodied people who have no experience of mental health, these kind of power structures, the truth might have existed for them, but for people from multiple marginalities, that's never been the truth. It's always been a post-truth or pre-truth. I love Moira's newly coined term, era for us. And that was partly what I was thinking when I assembled our panel, was people whose work expressed that found realities that were not previously acknowledged as history, as truth, as the enshrined facts of our objective, turn that off, white Western male world, And that was also why I was so fascinated in asking Genevieve to join us, because your work does a lot of that. So would you like to speak to this idea of post-truth before our next epic question arises?
I think this works, yes. So post-truth as a term reminds me of post-colonialism. It's exactly that concept that we're beyond something, that colonialism has ended and finished, and so we're in this new space, which of course we're not. And Eileen Morton Robinson uses the term post-colonising to say that framework, that structure of colonialism is continuing and hasn't ended, But also in the Australian context, truth has been a battleground. We're nowhere near that space where truths can be expressed safely and securely. That happened when the Stolen Generations stories started to surface in the late 1990s, and we had the Bring Them Home inquiry, and then the government just shut that down and reduced the truths of people's experiences and stories and realities of being removed from family to statistics and numbers and percentages, and reduced the actual lived trauma of people. And we've had that continuously over and over again. And our spaces of truth are battlegrounds as well. So our cultural institutions, our media, our education institutions, when we get to a point where we can start to share our history and to have the complexity and tragedy and trauma of this country represented in different spaces, there's always a pushback. And that's something that we have to be conscious of when we're thinking about post-truth. And I agree with you, absolutely. We're nowhere near a space of even truth-telling. We're asking for these spaces, and part of the Uluru Statement was to ask for a space for a Truth and Reconciliation Community space where these stories can be told and held and acknowledged and listened to. Because the problem is that often times in whatever framework, whether it's a cultural, artistic, educative framework, when these stories are told, they're not always valued or listened or heard. And I've certainly found that working in the space of memorialisation and frontier violence, which I've been for a few years now, but have been obsessed with since I was a kid. But the battlegrounds of history, just even acknowledging that a massacre took place somewhere. The work that goes into resisting that narrative and not acknowledging a space of trauma in our landscape is kind of extraordinary. The lengths that people will go to not hold truths and not really feel them. And I think there's a resistance, a national resistance that happens, it's embodied in individuals and communities as well, to not embrace the truth, to not hold that. And that means we can't heal. And that as a populace, as a whole country, we're not able to move forward on many, many things until we get to the truth, which I'm looking forward to. Just started.
And the other thing I'd like to say, which really taps into what you're saying, Genevieve, is that I am very cautious about the idea. I understand that there may be, that there are many levels to truth, but the idea that the truth is malleable I really resist that. And I think it's dangerous because there are some very, very fundamental truths about Australia's history, about gender violence. Those truths are not that hard to find. So in an oppressive culture where truths are bandied about as if they are opinions, they are not interchangeable. What you do with the evidence is the next step. But the evidence needs to be hung on to by those who'd like to move from a pre-truth era into a truth era. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. In that post-truth space, you can reject evidence. You can reject rationality. You can reject that this is a truth, that this happened, that this occurred. And I was interviewed recently on a talkback radio station, I won't mention who they are, and I had that very experience. I was stating things and I'm being ignored. The truths of what I was saying, this is the reality of this situation, and it was just ignored to enrage the listeners, to create a sense of anger and resentment that, you know, Indigenous people we put at the centre of something rather than on the outer sort of layers. So it is a very dangerous thing, I think, this idea that you can just not accept that there are some realities to a conversation or to an event.
At best ignored and at worst weaponised against the very marginalised peoples who it should be protecting. But this idea that Genevieve has flagged of spaces where the truth can exist and where we can safely express or engage with the truth leads to the heart of our topic today, which is the arts and artists as disruptors in this false environment of ideas of post-truth. So I wanted to kind of open with a quote from Audre Lorde, who some of you might be familiar with, Candy maybe not, but maybe other people are familiar with. Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. And I think that speaks to the role of the arts in creating these spaces that Genevieve has flagged, spaces where we can express ideas and, as Moira has said in the past, where we can create action, agency and urgency. So I would love just to briefly, before we go into specific works that you have all worked on, which I'll have many questions about, if you could each touch on that idea of the arts as that space for truth, for disruption, a space where arts can become advocacy and activism, what precedents there are for that, what you encountered and reacted to and motivated you to take on that kind of, whether it was conscious or subconscious, whether it was unavoidable, whether it was a choice or whether it happened organically, what led you to take on that mantle of artist as disruptor? Just a nice easy question.
Sure, yeah. I've got to say, going back and doing work in South Africa was really incredibly soul and heart opening for me, because I realised I'd been working in a canon that I didn't know I was working in, and that was quite extraordinary, particularly making work from the minute I, made work in my 20s that was political, that was queer, that was pushing against all this stuff, and that being very natural and normal for me. I have a political family. My grandfather was a dirty communist and was able to tour the world and talk about apartheid in a way that was very unusual for a coloured person, and talk about black rights. And it's really fascinating to read back articles and things like that of his tours in Canada and around the world. So I guess there was an image really early on that always stuck with me. He was in a political cartoon with de Klerk, and they were both wearing ballet. They were like Swan Lake, and there was the big bad man in cartoons of the day, with the big, lanky bad man with the big finger and the big hat, and the title was "Go Jump in Swan Lake." And it was something that my grandfather had done. He'd fought for essentially opening up audiences so that coloured people specifically, South Africa's very complex and specific, but could go to the ballet. And then for my mum, you know, growing up, when we got to Australia, she put us in everything she could put us in, because in South Africa she was too dark to be allowed to go to ballet class or do anything like that, or, you know, see a dentist and stuff. So for me, that very root of where I come from, which is also kind of quite weird being in the Arts Centre at the moment with the Merry Widow one and thinking, wow, you know, that's a political act in itself, the Merry Widow. Yeah, just who's allowed and who's not allowed and who's seen and who's not seen, and this bizarre fascination with a world, with that world. It's quite everyday, you know, it's a daily moment for me. But these ideas of who's allowed in and out and why, and more my own practice of decolonisation daily, you know, decolonising and moisturising. It's like, it's extraordinary, and I guess it's just in you. And I often say, like my friend Mo Brown has a poem called Black Girl Magic, and it starts by her saying, "You ain't supposed to be here, black girl." And I think about that every day when I'm on that stage for the MTC. And I look across at Bessie Holland and I think, you're not supposed to be here either, this is really fun. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, the struggles we have is saying, look, we're pushing our physicality and our souls and our hearts into this space to say, you know, for the next fat girls, for the next black girls, for the next queer girls, we've made some ground here, you know. And when tough stuff happens, we get to speak to that. And if we don't speak to it, I guess that's where, you know, some people hate the burden of having to speak up and shift and change things all the time. I think my South Africanness allows me that, because South Africans are just they're just built for political activism, loud, because there's all different sorts of political activism, but it's very much in my blood to speak about justice and equality. And in South Africa, you can talk to like a 6-year-old to a 60-year-old about this stuff. And that's what I realised is coming from that background to Australia, and of course collaborating and connecting with everybody else, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't intend to be an artist, and I struggled with that word for a really long time. I wasn't comfortable calling myself an artist at all. But I had some creative life. You know, I did do some things in my study and then left that to go and work at the Koori Heritage Trust, and I was recording stories and travelling around the state. It was a great privilege listening to elder stories under Uncle Jim Burke, who's speaking tomorrow, and learning more about myself and my culture and this space. And then I started working with the images, and there were these beautiful 19th century portraits. We got them from the State Library. We had all these different partnerships, and our job was to repatriate these images back to community. And there were many images that were named, and we knew where they came from, but there were a series of images that were completely disembodied from place, from name. They were obviously a sort of product. They were representations of Aboriginal people that say Australian Aborigine at the bottom, and there'd be a man sitting in a studio with a wooden floor and a painted backdrop who'd been asked to take his clothes off, and was represented as a noble savage, unnamed and displaced. And yeah, these images really haunted me, and I started to dream about them. When I dreamed up a work that became an artwork, but
Picturing the old people. So I might skip ahead to that part of the next question for you before we go back to this question with Moira. I would love you to talk a bit to the ideas of the way that picturing the old people was a reappropriation agency into the idea of a truth or a history that was completely false. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it brought it deconstructed those images because they were constructions and they were passed around settler colonies, including Australia and New Zealand and Canada, as a kind of currency in race. So people would have in their lounge rooms, they'd have photo albums where they could put people in hierarchies of race, with white supremacy at the top. So if you were othered, you were of interest and you were on these little carte de vis cards, which were like baseball cards, so people could purchase these things and create their own little racial hierarchies in their parlours, you know, at home. So this work, which became an artwork, was 5 panels telling the stories behind the construction of these images. And it's because they haunted me and because I was compelled to do something because they're unnamed and dispossessed, and kind of honour the people who'd been through this process, because you could see the pain in their eyes. You know, you could see, you could read those images on an emotional level and see what had occurred in those spaces and the disempowering that happened in those studios with white photographers constructing representations of originality. So I made this piece, and then everyone was calling me an artist, and I was like, okay. Okay, I guess maybe that's what I am. But it was just because I had no other way to communicate what I was feeling, and because it wasn't just a intellectual engagement with the history and with the representation issues. It was actually a visceral, emotional, bodily reaction to these images, and that was the only way I could communicate what I was feeling and what I felt I needed to say. And from that, you know, it took me many years to think of myself as an artist, but I remember talking to Tony Birch, who'd sort of been through the history wars and all of those battles about truth, and people kept saying to him, you know, where are all the Aboriginal historians? Why don't we have Aboriginal historians in the academy? You know, and he said, we have so many historians. We have filmmakers, we have writers, we have artists. They're our historians, they're our storytellers, and they're the people who are disrupting the canon and Western knowledge systems and presenting Aboriginal perspectives and stories and realities and truths. And so I've, you know, over the years have understood myself as part of this wider movement of family and friends and colleagues and people who are doing this work, disrupting the archive, disrupting colonial narratives, and it's a huge movement that isn't really celebrated. You know, and that's part of what I'm trying to do with my PhD now, is to just identify that this has actually happened, that Aboriginal artists have been doing this from the early days of the colony and are still doing it at a kind of extraordinary level.
So like a white fellow would have these tiny cards of Aboriginal people, then have like a huge post, like painting on the wall of him on a horse or something. Yeah, gotcha.
Little book, and you know, and it was Indigenous people, it was criminals, you know, because all around the sort of eugenics movement as well. And there were little cards, like baseball cards you could collect. And this is your Australian Aboriginal card, and you get this and get that, and no one was named.
Because I knew about them, but only from showgirls and circus freaks. So I've seen a lot of those carte de visites, but I haven't seen any of those ones. So,
That also speaks interestingly to the idea of multiple marginalities and how these oppressive structures that we're able to confront through our art have affected racialised others, sexualised others, gendered others. In the case of the freak shows, people of differing abilities and races and genders. I might jump to Candy, because now that we're kind of combining two questions, which I love. So you talked about your background and how that politically activated and informed your artworks. Can you speak a bit about how that then developed into, we're going to do 2 different works that you've been involved in. The way that Hot Brown Honey is a joyous confrontation of white patriarchy and a bit of a clapback to white patriarchy and a call for solidarity for women of colour. And the way in which Lilith, which you did with MT's Neon's program, spoke back directly to Dutch colonialism in the way that you satirically played a white eugenic scientist. And I think that will flow on very nicely from the way that Genevieve reappropriated these evil eugenicists.
Yeah, look. It's funny because you're just doing when you're a young person, and then you get to look back a bit when you get a bit of age and think, oh, I'm a part of a movement. There's a canon, there's a history, there's a legacy here. With Hot Brown Honey, it was really interesting. It was about you know, skirting around and being in lots of different festival contexts and thinking we just don't see our bodies. I mean, right now, when I watch Netflix or something like that, like I've got to be honest, I just had a little breakdown when I watched Handmaid's Tale and the woman who came to check the baby was black. Sorry, spoiler for anybody who's not caught up. Because there's so few black people in the show, but then I also tipped on something in me which was about, because, you know, this woman is the highest in her field as a baby doctor, and it just hit in me this thing of like, because I didn't have, there was something that came up just now at Vivid yesterday, there was tweeting about it, I didn't have peers and icons and inspiration. I feel that the Australian industry, there's one of the most painful points for me is that the women of colour that should have been writing plays and writing films and on stage were shut out and shut down. And I've met a few of them along the way where I know they have diaries full of screenplays and stuff. They were just so shut out, to the point even where I came out of NIDA and went and did playwriting salons and stuff and wanted to centralise my story and my family. And at that time, you know, the likes of Chris Mead, who's now at MTC changing the game completely, he just said, this probably won't get done on an Australian stage. I recently saw Barbershop and I was like, which is a play that came from the UK, Inua Allen's play, where he's got 12 black men of different age groups and from across Africa on stage. And it was very similar, but with women, something I wanted to do really early on out of NIDA. And it was just, the point was, we don't believe Australia are interested, you know, and definitely for me as an actor, we are not interested in a woman who looks like you. It doesn't matter that you are talented or funny or whatever. We are just not interested, and that's apartheid, yeah? So with Hot Brown Honey, you know, a lot of, I think artists are always looking for the antidote. Artists are often naively or misguidedly keeping on trying to find love and connection in a hopeless place.
It might be misguided or it might be completely visioned.
Yeah, it could. I flow between a rock back, nightly rock back and forth. So there's the thing about Hot Brown Honey from my perspective, because I came in collaborating with my sister and Lisa Falafi, who've gone on to create the current show. So I was the originator and directed and wrote that first instance of it. I wanted it to be a gift to women that were like us, that looked like us. And the other funny thing was, because Lisa's cousin Fez is in Briefs, and he was like, kept throwing her this, do a female version of Briefs, do a female version of Briefs. And that just seemed very, you know, authentic to all of us, because what was really funny is the first pieces that we all made were all deeply satirical. So there was no like, Devon tease, I'm really doing this. Oh, I'm taking my clothes off. It's sexy. Don't you love my body stuff? Because all of us were like, our mothers would smack us here to home, right? So we had to work out ways of making it for us. And that was a really interesting kind of moment too, where we realised, and there is some stuff that has gone on in different shows, like Benji Ra, who's an extraordinary performer, did a really early piece at an early block party. They said something to me, she said something to me that really threw me, which, this is the thing about where we're in our pre-truth phase, because Australian culture has been violent towards people of colour and people of queer backgrounds for so long. And she said to me, she wanted to do something that referenced Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And I was like, oh yeah, like, you know, Filipino background, mum probably doesn't like that you're at the time a gay man. And they were like, no, that has haunted me my entire young life, that there was a Filipino woman shooting ping pong balls out of her vagina, because there is no other Filipino woman on any other film or television show. So when people would meet my mother, kids at school, the dads around me, this would be something that they had to live with and go up against. And I guess for Australian film and TV culture, understanding that because we've only seen ourselves in these small parts, if at all, this begins to be something, you know, like the amount of kids, Tongan and Samoan kids that got teased as Chris Lilly's Jonah from Tonga came out. All that stuff about why do you have the agency and there is no agency for anybody else. So Hot Brown Honey was born of that, oh, we're going to do it ourselves, we're going to do exactly what we want, we're going to just talk to each other. So if you want to come on the journey, anybody who isn't from these communities or who isn't us, cool. But the other thing that was vitally interesting, I think, because we had a very collaborative style of outside eyeing and stuff, was it was our gaze. And that's not something that's easily tangible or understood, because we also still have a lot of people throughout, say, the theatre industry. They may be queer, they may be women, but they still work in a white male gaze. So the concept of what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is acceptable, what is sexy, what is interesting, what is excellent, is still within that framework. So we started going, no, it's just going to come from the way we've lived in this world and the way, and what we see and what we don't get to see, what we dream of seeing. So we kind of put our fantasies onto the stage and, you know, broke the back of the Fringe Festival circuit. So that was a good outcome.
And it also had the outcome of what a lot of us in the arts talk about as the Hot Brown Honey effect, which was for the first time as people of colour turning up to see a show, we were not one of only one or two people of colour in the audience watching the show. And that was quite remarkable because it made us realise that in the state of a pre-truth society when it comes to race relations in this country, not only were we not used to seeing ourselves authentically represented on stages, we were not used to seeing ourselves in mainstream, large company audiences.
And that's my current hurt right now. And excitingly, Daniel Clark and I are collaborating on, you know, a process that I'm now using as my life process of, you know, decolonising the fuck out of whatever I'm doing. But so I'm working with the Arts Centre on an outreach program alongside a new work that's coming from South Africa, The Fall, All Roads Lead to Decolonisation, which I would say do not miss, because it's, like, I know everybody talks about unmissable, but I've never seen, I mean, I know it's my country and there's lots of like language of my granny and people who look like me, but I've never seen non-binary, queer, the dangerous question of being gay and African, the dangerous question of pushing up against tradition, truth and all that embodied in this incredible company. So we were like, well, if this is going to go on here, I would like safe passage for those, for this show. And absolutely, that the audience, the shock of recognition for a young person of colour to see a non-binary artist like themselves on stage. Like, these are, for me, those soul-breaking moments where it heals so much to see that reflection, but also the absolute authority and autonomy of it being written, made, created from and back, yeah? So I think we all know here in the arts, we can't ever underestimate that extraordinary movement where we do get to shift hearts, minds, but also for people who've never seen themselves to see themselves. And I think, yeah, because there's no such thing as nirvana, I'm working on it, but I'm still working in that uncomfortability of being in the house and feeling uncomfortable and wanting things to shift and working out how to negotiate those shifts. I have a cultural safety coach. I have like lots of things in place because I'm like, I want to see the change, and I'm also really aware of the amount of unconscious bias. So it's really difficult when those things are invisible. But then fun things happen, like Lilith, where I'm the only female identifying woman who's asked to audition for a role up against all black actors to play Charles Penworth in
Lilith the Jungle Girl that was created by Sisters Grimm. And that in its own self is really exciting because it's the first kind of case of where someone's gone, that energy, that gravitas, that what is in that person's going to work across the gender line. And also you win. And I was like, thank you. This is really, really cool for me. And then I get to play a Dutchman and I get to decolonise from the minute I step on stage to ridicule from the inside. It would be my ancestors' wildest dreams of portraying such a fucking idiot. And it was really, really fun. And it's really, 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 really fun because so much is going on and it's so smart. And I was saying the first folks to buy the show in Edinburgh was the Festival of the Netherlands. So I'm going to be playing a Dutchman in Holland.
Yeah, satirical smackdown of colonial authority systems.
Yes. So I'm happy. That's like one of like these are cases, and I try to live my life like that, where you get to fully embody the movement, and as actors we can do that. We get to embody it, and I feel like at times, you know, what's written on the body is so extraordinary, and then what Jen was talking about is that weird space of then going, like the amount of times I've heard and my young mentees have heard artistic directors say to them, you're just so fantastic, I just don't know where to put you.
And the idea that you can be too much.
Yeah.
So we might jump to Moira with that. Because on the idea of the body and the bodies on stage, the idea of marginalised bodies, and the idea of variety shows, because we also heard Candy mention briefs, and the way that briefs centred expressions of authentic young queer masculinities outside of macho tropes, the way that Hot Brown Honey focused on centering stories of women of colour. So I'd love to talk about these ideas of artist as disruptor, personal as political, arts as activism, which is at the centre of Moira's practice, and these ideas of variety shows and the body. I want to kick off by, to get you started, with a quote that I adore from you, which I remember when we were in Cuba and we were you were giving a speech in Cuba about the show Glory Box. They said, describe it in one sentence, this thing between activism and art and how you negotiate that. And you said it's a discourse on social justice dressed up as a great night out. So if that's the stimulus point. Off you go.
So what I actually said, because I'm all about alliteration, I said it's a discourse on human rights dressed up as a hot night out, and all the her. So, Candy, you talked about a movement, and so two things. I mean, there's so much I'm learning. I knew I'd learn a lot today. Anyway, Finya Caden-Smith, I'm all about manifestos. I love a manifesto. And I came from a background, an Irish Catholic background, and I trained as an environmental scientist. I worked as an environmental scientist in World Heritage areas and a whole range of other things. And then I started working in human rights, and I worked in gender and development for about 10 years. And I worked a lot on gender violence, and then I moved into the area of child trafficking. So anyway, so I've had a multifaceted human rights background, and one of the things that I think about is cultural movements. And I actually wrote a manifesto, and it's short, and I'm going to read it to you. So a couple of years ago, the National Gallery of Victoria asked me to be a creative fellow, and they'd never appointed one before. So I was the obvious choice. And one of the things that I'm really excited by, and that plays into my environmental science practice, is microcosms. Now, microcosms or microclimates are specific coming together, so a specific alchemy of geography, of soil, of weather patterns, meteorology, and things happen in microclimates that happen nowhere else. So the birds of paradise are a result of a microclimate. A microclimate on the side of a mountain can have untold biodiversity There are pines in certain microclimates in Tasmania that are thousands of years old. And when I think about social change and I think about artistic change and I think about hopelessness, and I think that hopelessness is a political tool. I'm just going to stick with that for a moment. It is true throughout history that hopelessness has been used to stop people from doing stuff, because we all know, and if we don't, we should, we all know that there is nothing more dangerous than a person with active hope. A person with active hope can get together with other people with active hope and they can change anything. I brought Desmond Tutu. I never go anywhere without him. Talk about a person with active hope. First voted in his 60s. So I think about microclimates, and I think that microclimates in the art and microclimates in cultural movements sometimes might seem like a tiny thing, but in actual fact what they do is they can create lighthouses, they can create beacons, they can create weather patterns of change that people locally or globally or nationally or regionally can go, look at that. That's what's possible. So that's really exciting. And in art, mostly by men, but there's lots of ladies there, but they're not talked about so much, there's lots of microclimates of activism, and they're called movements and they're called isms. So anyway, I thought, what is Finucane and Smith? What are they? What ism are we? And I thought, we are unrealism. We are the unrealists. So here's the manifesto. We are the unrealists. We practice unrealism. We have unrealistic expectations of ourselves, of each other, of society, of politics, and of our journey together towards peace, justice, and equality, compassion, respect, and total art. We create unrealistic work. Together we create a new reality, a new real. We are the new exquisites, rare, excoriating, intensely felt, extremely beautiful, delicate, and yes, affected, and overly concerned with our clothes. We are dandies. We are a declaration of magnificence over mediocrity, of human rights over hubris and humiliation, of art over extinction, diversity over drivel, burlesque over bureaucracy, action over aphorisms, learning over lectures, money where our mouths are, walk where our talk is. We see women artists and creative leaders against backdrops of misogyny, climbing cliff faces of discrimination and lack of celebration and winning. We strain our ears for lesser heard voices. We are inspired by difference. We are curious about the people and the world. We know we have much to learn. We pledge bold, entertaining art, powerful red-hot chicks, powerful voices coming at you from influences, cultures, and people other than your own. We are uncomfortably magnificent, magnificently exciting, reassuringly human, relentlessly hospitable, completely flawed. We prioritise equality over a specious meritocracy, the extraordinary over polished and polite. We guarantee hair on the neck and goosebumps in the groin. Join us. So that's it in a nutshell for me.
So we have 7 minutes left and one more question to go. Because I'm just so psychic like that I had the foresight to construct our panel in such a way. I do want to mention before we close with this last question, Moira's idea of the microcosms of movements that become lighthouses and beacons. And in choosing which panelists I wanted to invite and work with today, I was thinking of who are 3 of the strong, powerful women artists who I see as beacons. So thank you to these 3 formidable genius beacons for joining us today. So we've got 7 minutes and I have my last question, which is I'd like some closing points from all 3 of you on these 2 different provocations. We'll try to keep them concise and incendiary. That's what we're looking for, concise and incendiary. So for number 1, what words of wisdom do you have about agency and urgency for artists, especially young emerging artists who are struggling against the gatekeepers and powers that be? And on the flip side of that, what words of challenge do you have to those gatekeepers, those powers that be, arts administrators, organisations, institutions, policymakers, governments, the powers that be, you know. So those two sides of the coin, words of wisdom, concise and incendiary. Let's go.
I was listening to the first part of what you were saying and I was thinking it's really about the gatekeepers. Because we've got these wonderful, so many young emerging artists with such passion and hope and power, and they're going to do what they're going to do. But it's really about the powers that be and letting go of power. People need to let go of power. They need to, what is it? Claire Land says they need to reckon with their own complicity.
Yes.
So it's reckoning with complicity, and the question is, what are you willing to give up? Really. And when we're talking about decolonisation in this country, it's a question for everybody. What are you willing to give up in terms of your power that's been accrued because of the history of violence that this country has experienced? So are you willing to give up your position? Are you willing to core fund us? Are you willing to create space for other people to take over your position in 5-10 years? These are the big questions. And there's so much value in letting go. When you see institutions and organisations and companies do that, what comes with it, the richness that comes with really engaging and deep listening rather than surface listening, but listening with not just your ears, with your heart, and with a commitment to a new way forward, to actually listen to what people are telling you. What comes from that is extraordinary, and you see it. So what are you willing to give up is my question for the powers that be, and that's really the only way we're going to have change in the sector, and more broadly in our country.
It's like fucking, when you give something up though, you always gain something else. When you decide to move from being the dominant to being the giver, you experience something else. And it's not as binary as that either. There's a multiplicity, as we all know, of positions, of places to be, of things to feel. So think about it like that. It's like the same old meal every day, the same old sex every day. What if, there was a spiritual lift that shifted that across? I can guarantee it's going to be better. I can guarantee it. But also, what I always say to young people is, first of all, I personally don't give a fucking shit about what the current kind of straight, white, cis zeitgeist, like, please. And what I care about is what people from across the intersection feel, first and foremost. So even for the young white men that get to be in my classes, have the honour of that, I teach them to de-center that and to actually center the truth of themselves, to be remarkable. And when it comes to the institutions and things like that, I feel like it's not a, I often, this is the hardest barrier, because I think it's kind of clean and clear when people know what they're doing. But it's very difficult when people are unconscious of what they're doing. And that turn to consciousness, in that immersing of yourself in scholarship that's all out there, like, I feel like taking pictures of my bookshelf and just sending them. The scholarship is out there, the stuff to immerse in is out there. It's like who you support and who has your time, who gets your box office, yeah? And it's like Gods of Egypt versus I'm a Witch. One written by white men that decided to wipe out all of Egypt, and Christian, like that is for me the epitome of what I might talk about if you want to visually understand it. To I'm a Witch by Regani, who was a Welsh Zambian woman who just brought out this incredible movie where straight away it's from her gaze and we see everything from a completely different perspective to what we've seen before. So it's like turning the camera around. But I can guarantee that it'll be delicious and wonderful and extraordinary. And that probably what you're eating right now, for me, sometimes we have a funny thing of like, me and my sister go, oh no, they're in the cave eating the poo cake, because it's about people who watch somebody putting in a bit of poo into the cake mix and then sitting down and going, oh no, it's really delicious, and you're actually eating shit cake. It's like what the elephant in the room is, what the stench is. Put your finger on the stench, you know. Yeah, I'm just saying, there's a lot of other foods out there. Romeo is not the only fruit to quote Jean Tong.
We've got 2 more minutes.
Alright, so I guess what I'd say, there's 2 things I want to say. The thing I'd say to emerging artists and gatekeepers is the same thing. Trust the audience. In my life as an artist, I rarely hear people talking about the audience. I hear people talking about ticket sales and demographics and subscribers with a bit of an eye roll and all of that kind of stuff. But I don't often hear people talking about the audience. An attitude of relentless hospitality brings you to an audience that is broad, exciting, curious. Why on earth are they there if they're not curious? They've got a bucket load to do, and they had to pay money, and they had to get here after a hard day. So they're there with their curious, open hearts. And emerging artists can trust the audience, can leap over both their own barriers and the barriers that are presented to go directly to the audience, because the audience in terms of live theatre are really the only thing that matters. Funders, reviewers, blah, 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 come and go. The audience is what matters. And the audience, if gatekeepers turn around and look at the audience with that different gaze, the audience are ready. The audience are ready. We toured Caravan Burlesque for 8 months around Australia. All gatekeepers originally told me the audiences weren't ready. Let me tell you, they were hysterically ready. So, and the other thing...
Several of them became artists in the show.
Well, I mean,
That's how
absolutely.
ready they were.
And, you know, I mean, so ready. And you know, when we went to Tennant Creek, and everybody, oh, don't go to Tennant Creek, Mara, it's so dangerous. And, you know, there's a lot going on there. But when we went there, people were so overexcited, they bursted into a cabaret group the day we left. And I've been going back there ever since. Long story, so exciting. So the audience are ready, and the audience are generous. You know, the generosity with which I was treated in Tennant Creek by people who could have viably and with all good reason slapped me upside and told me to piss off is amazing. So the audience are ready. Don't look at this. Look at the audience. That's who you're going to. Second thing I wanted to say was, let's get lucky. You know, there's a lot of talk at the moment about policies, about diversity policies and sexual harassment policies and blah, blah, blah. And policies, you know, that's great. It's good to have a policy in place. But to reframe that as, let's get lucky. Let's make our outfits more representative. Hey, why not? Instant luck. You've got more genius in there. You've got more insights. You've got more stories. You've got a bigger audience. You're getting lucky. Somebody calls out sexual harassment in your organisation. You're lucky. You're lucky. A moment of pain, yes, but you're actually lucky because the pain and the difficulty and the history is theirs, but everybody benefits from a society that is more representative, that is more just, that is more exciting, that is more multifaceted. So that's my thing. Let's all get lucky.
Fantastic. Please thank our formidable panel of geniuses, Robert Cruz, Candy Bowers, Mara Quintana. Go forth and disrupt.
And a big thank you to Mama Alto for that extraordinary lesson. Now we have a problem because at this point there are now 7 parallel things that you could get involved with. And one of them is following these 4.
Including our audience Q&A.
The idea that anyone doesn't want to follow these 4 for Q&A beggars belief, but I promise you there is no shit cake in any of the options. Not one piece of shit cake. The cake is delicious. We're moving to the forum part of the proceedings. So in addition to the Q&A for this session and the toolbox stuff in the treetops, There are 5 different forums that are framed as provocations from the industry leaders, and those 5 provocations are freedom of artistic expression, how far is too far, the creative industries using our power for good and not evil, fact or furphy, economic renewal in regional Victoria, enough already, do we need more art, and do we want to be a 24-hour city? Each of these 5 sessions are going to be run twice. You can see them in 5 different venues. Hi. You can see them in 5 different venues, including this one. There are very willing staff and volunteers who will take you to the right venue if you're not sure if you are there. The one in here will be the Freedom of Artistic Expression session. It'll kick off in about 5 minutes, but otherwise, roam free, and we'll see you a bit later on.
Everybody, one last thing I'd like you to